Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the UK Customs Academy, in which we will look at rules of origin. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I will be on hand to facilitate any questions or queries you may have during this webinar. And you can use the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions and send in comments at any point. Though please do consider that any questions we will ask will need to be broadly relevant to the whole audience. We are also recording today's webinar and sharing a link to the recording of it, and you can send a request for a copy of the slides to info@ukcustomsacademy.co.uk. Just to quickly say a little bit about who we are, the UK Customs Academy has been set up by the Institute of Export and International Trade and KGH Customs Services at the request of HMRC to help prepare businesses and individuals to gain the knowledge and skills around international customs that will be essential for trade in the years to come. Now, if we move to the next slide, before we go into the main presentations, I'm just going to launch a quick poll for everyone, in which I am going to ask, how prepared do you think your business is for the end of the transition period? And just while leaving you to answer that question, absolutely delighted to introduce today's presenter. We have Holly Tonge, the Director of Special Projects at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Holly, how are you today?
I'm great, thanks, Will. Hello, everyone.
It's not too hot where you are today, I hope.
No, I think I'm a bit too far north.
It is sweltering down here in North London, I have to say. But we will hopefully get some thunder at some point. It's a strange thing to wish for, but there we go. So I'll just leave you a few more seconds to answer this question, and I'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just to share the results of that poll. So, well, a lot of you are quite or very prepared. So 79% of you are ranging between quite and very prepared. 18% not very prepared, and 0% not at all prepared, which I suppose isn't a surprise because everyone is already engaged with the UK Customs Academy. But those are some good results there, and for those not very prepared, hopefully we can help you climb up the ladder to prepared in the next few months. But anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Holly.
Thanks, Will. And yes, welcome everyone to this webinar on rules of origin. So I'm going to talk you through the highlights. So to start with, what do we actually mean by origin? So origin, when it comes to international trade and the movement of goods across international borders, specifically relates to an economic nationality of those goods being transported and traded. So it's a really important definition that sticks with those goods throughout the supply chain. Not dissimilar to nationality of an individual, your nationality does not change as you transit through different countries. If I, as a British person, go on holiday to the USA, for example, my nationality does not change, and much the same applies to goods. So really what these rules are all around is how that origin is initially established and what actually has to happen to a product in order for its economic nationality to change. And you'll see that a fairly substantial change needs to occur for that nationality to shift from one country to another. The reason it is quite important to understand that nationality is because origin is one of the cornerstones of the information required on customs import entries and also for export movements as they arrive at destination borders. There are three main items that will determine the import taxes and various controls in place on goods, and they are customs value, the origin of the goods, and the tariff classification. So origin is one of those really fundamental cornerstones that needs to be right on the international paperwork. In terms of origin, it's usually sitting alongside a tariff code, but just to show you an example of where you would actually need to understand the origin of the goods just to arrive at the correct commodity code. You can see here in this highlighted example where some plastic kitchenware actually holds different tariff codes within the UK tariff, depending on whether it came from China or Hong Kong, or whether it came from somewhere else. So this is where the origin will impact in its own right classification. Otherwise, you are arriving at a commodity code, and then depending on what trade deals or control measures or quotas are available, the country of origin will dictate how they relate to the products that you're dealing with. So that's the basic definition. Then there are different types of origin. So it's really important that you understand that there are two fundamental different types of origin that one product can hold. The first is non-preferential origin. So this is the equivalent where you look at this product is made in China, the UK, wherever. So before we get into anything broader in relation to trade deals and things, the very basics of where was that product made? And that origin status is applicable to all goods. So everything has a non-preferential origin. Everything was made somewhere. And that origin is used for various measures, whether it's trade embargoes, whether there's quotas from specific countries of origin. And also for the collection of trade statistics. Now that product may or may not also have a preferential origin. Now preferential origin is specifically only going to be applied to those goods if they are being imported from or exported to a country where there is a trade agreement in place. And the purpose of preferential origin, rather than just to state where something was made, is to determine whether those goods can get a lower or zero rated customs duty on arrival, so upon import. So just to give you an example here, something might be made in the UK, but might currently hold EU preferential origin status. So as you can see, that one product could hold two separate origins and they sit at different levels. Non-preferential origin is always at country level. Preferential origin might be a regional level if it's related to a group of countries. For example, as we are currently trading as not a member of the EU, but we're still engaged at the moment as a member of the EU Customs Union at least. So we trade on EU trade agreements, which is really fundamental importance here, because when I get to the Brexit piece, you'll see that this is where there's going to be some significant changes. Okay, so we're going to start with just non-preferential origin and what constitutes how you determine the origin of those goods. So you have some stated rules of origin. There are some at the moment within the EU legislation, and there are some specific definitions as it comes to non-preferential origin. But broadly speaking, the origin is determined via one of two routes. So either the product is wholly obtained and therefore that country is used to dictate where that product came from. So by wholly obtained, broadly speaking, we mean born, bred or mined from the country where those goods came from. So there's nothing else involved. There's no other products being added or incorporated into that product. So you're talking the earlier chapters of the tariff codes usually, where you're looking at vegetables, minerals, animals, that sort of thing. So that's the first way. If that doesn't apply because you've got more than one origin, then you're usually looking at processed products, which generally involve inputs from different origins to get to the whole. And with there, what you're doing is you're associating the made in country as the country in which the goods underwent their last substantial, economically justified processing or working. So it might be that the product started in South Africa and then was imported into India, became further processed, and then in its final state in India, then got imported into the UK. So that in that case would be Indian origin rather than the South African where it started, just because it underwent its last substantial transformation more recently in India. And when we're talking a substantial transformation, there are some very specific definitions of that, which we'll get into. But usually, if broadly speaking, you can consider that to be a change in commodity code, because you're changing the nature of the product, what its essential character is. There are, of course, with customs, as I'm sure you'll be aware, exemptions of all of these general rules depending on the exact commodity you're handling. So if you took something and it was 100% strength and you diluted it by 99% and the tariff code remained the same, but maybe you could still argue that the origin had changed because the nature of the product had significantly shifted. So there are always exceptions, and I'll discuss where you find those rules as we go through. Okay, so where it comes to proving the non-preferential origin, on imports into the UK, for normal goods, we're not requiring, generally speaking, any certificates to demonstrate that origin. The customs authorities here will accept a supplier statement on a commercial invoice just saying these goods are of Swiss origin, for example, or Russian origin. So that's all we need to confirm that origin on arrival here. If, however, those goods are being imported and are subject to import quotas, which is where we allow a limited amount of goods to be imported, maybe a reduced or zero rate of duty from certain origin destinations, then proof of origin in the form of a certificate of origin from the exporter is generally required. So that it's by exception that we ask for it here under those specific sort of circumstances. When you're exporting, it's really going to depend on the export market you're exporting your goods to. If they require proof of origin, which some countries will, some countries may not, that's where you're going to, for example, a Chamber of Commerce and asking them to raise a certificate of origin. So here we have an example of an EC certificate of origin. And in addition, what we also get is British Arab certificates of origin, which are specifically used to export goods to the Arab League countries. And they both performing the exact same function. It's just that the normal certificate of origin can be issued directly by the Chamber of Commerce or other relevant approved body. The British Arab one bounces through the relevant embassy as well, so it just takes a little longer and it costs a little more. But they're both just confirming the country of origin. What a lot of people do is go on the Chamber of Commerce easy site or visit a Chamber of Commerce, and they're ticking a box to say that they understand the rules and that the goods underwent this last economically justified processing in in the UK without actually really reading that or understanding what you're ticking. So there are circumstances where that might have happened and the goods arrive at a country of destination and the customs authorities open up a container and what they see is actually like made in China on the products, for example. So just be mindful that these things can be checked on arrival and only ever raise these certificates of origin for, say, the UK or the EU if you can confirm that that is where those products last underwent that significant transformation. In terms of labelling, again, for imports, the law is very specific around precious metals, footwear, food and drink, and some products for children, where the origin has to be declared. Other than that, it is an optional field, but cannot be misleading. So you have to clearly state where it was made. When you're exporting, it's generally best practice to have that made in labeling in case it's a requirement at the country of destination. So it's very much industry norm and best practice to state the origin. But if there's a commercial reason that you would rather not declare it and you're not dealing or trading with these particular categories of goods, then depending on the markets that those goods are being sold in and the specific requirements there, you may or may not get away with not declaring it. So again, quite a complex area that you would need to research based on the commodities you trade with and the countries you're looking to trade with. So that's non-preferential origin in a nutshell. What we're going to do now is move on to preferential origin. And so this is the part that is going to be influenced by Brexit quite significantly. So as I'm sure we all know, the UK has now left the EU. However, the withdrawal agreement allows us to trade under EU terms and trade deals until the end of this year. From the 1st of January next year, we're going to start trading under the new UK trade deals. So depending on where you're importing from or exporting to and what sort of certification comes or you have to raise with those shipments, that may all, change somewhat from next year. So what we thought we'd do is have a couple of quick polls here, which Will's now going to host before I get into any more detail to see, what your thoughts are in this area at the moment. So Will.
Many thanks, Holly. So launching the first of these polls now. This one is asking how much of an impact will the changes of trade in 2021 have on your business when we lose access to the EU deals and move over to UK ones? So the options there are low, mostly dealing with countries without trade deals. Medium, may lose access to EU deals but hopeful for new ones. Or high, concerns over some EU trade deals the UK has not got yet. Just while leaving you to answer that poll, just to remind everyone that you can ask any questions at any point using the control panel. There's a question drop box about 2/3 of the way down the GoToWebinar panel. And as stated at the start, we will ask broadly general questions which are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't get into company specifics as such. But I will now close that poll in 3, 2, 1. Share the results now. So 49% said there'll be a medium impact, with a further 35% saying high, only 15% low. So Holly, I'll just launch a second poll quickly, but then invite you to, do you have any thoughts about that poll? So yeah, 45% saying there'll be a medium impact.
Yeah, it's really good to get that live feedback, and it's probably where I would have assumed most companies would be at, but yeah, it's good before we go into the next delivery to know that would be the concerns and hopes.
Of course, and Now just on to the second poll, which is what is your understanding regarding the UK-EU trade agreement if one is reached? So the options here are all goods will be 0% duty if a trade deal is agreed. Some goods may be 0% duty and others reduced in a deal. Goods will need to meet the complex origin rules for deal access, or evidence will need to be produced to customs for access to the deal. As you may have noticed, we do the character limits with the options, so that's why they're slightly shortened there. But again, I'll give I'll give you all a few more seconds to answer that poll. What is your expectation, do you think, Holly, in terms of how people may answer this?
Yeah, again, it's just good to gauge before we move on, because I think that maybe some companies out there do just think that that trade deal might make everything easier than possibly it will. So yeah, let's see what the results come back as and have a further chat.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to share the results now. So only 7% think all goods will be 0% duty if a deal is agreed to. 57% are saying some goods may be 0% duty, others reduced, and 20% will need to meet complex origin rules, and 17% evidence will need to be produced. Is that roughly what you would have expected, Holly?
It's really interesting, actually, Will. So great that there isn't too much of an assumption that everything's going to be zero rated. You know, we're yet to understand how those negotiations are going in that level of detail. So we really don't know. I think it's hoped that the duties would be as low as possible and zero rated wherever possible. But if there's particular products that the UK or the EU are looking to protect in terms of their own kind of core manufacturing competencies, then possibly they'll insist on duties in those areas. But in terms of the rules of origin and evidence needed, it's interesting that they've polled quite low because there's not any trade agreements really that exist that don't require rules of origin and evidence to be produced in order to claim a 0% duty or a reduced rate of duty. Of course, the UK and the EU may push for something more modern and more futuristic and more facilitative of trade. So it's not to say they won't make that more simplified, but certainly if we base it on the new trade agreements that the EU is signing recently, for example, South Korea and Canada, they're still associated with complex rules of origin. So yeah, we'll get stuck in now.
Very interesting. Thank you everyone for the answers, and yeah, back to you, Holly.
Yeah, thanks everyone for participating in that. It's really interesting because the problem is there's stuff in the media and stuff here, there, and everywhere, but no one's really looking at a high level at just how this works in practice, generally speaking. So the trade agreements the UK has signed that we know will be in place as of the 1st of January 2021 are listed here. So this is the extensive list of that. The UK government are publishing updates. So there's also a list of countries where negotiations are in progress. And there's countries where either the negotiations haven't started yet or are not expected to be concluded until after the 1st of January. So if you're currently trading with any of these countries, then there should be a level of continuity from next year. Also, which I didn't include on this slide, is a generalized system of preferences. So they're the unilateral trade agreements that we have access to through the EU, which allow reduced or zero rated imports from the developing countries. So what we do know is that the UK are going to continue accessing the GSP scheme. It's not an EU specific arrangement. And that will continue as well from 1st of January. So if you're importing and claiming a reduced rate from any developing countries, you will also continue to do that from next year. Everything else is really a watch and see what the government do between now and the start of next year. So there's going to be some ongoing monitoring required in terms of any other countries that you might currently be trading with. So when we look at preferential origin, and this is where it can get a bit confusing as a topic, it's fairly similar, but there are some distinct differences. So some of the main differences in terms of preferential origin is that there's a principle of territoriality. So the working or processing has to be carried out in the territories of the parties. So rather than just your made-in country, for example, EU at the moment allows that working or processing to be carried out at any of those EU member states. So it's a much broader availability, geographically speaking, in order to meet that preferential origin. Now, of course, from the 1st of January, that's going to be reduced to for UK manufacturers to UK only. And we're not going to be able to include all of that EU options. However, that will just relate to the UK trade agreements outside of the EU, and then I'll come on to what it means for the EU shortly. There's a direct transport rule, which is a really important consideration. So there is it's built into trade agreements so that the goods don't leave a country, for example, Vietnam, and then get shipped via somewhere else en route and are changed. And therefore, the origin is just being used to claim a reduction in duty. So to try and combat that, most of these preferential trade agreements include a direct transport rule that says the goods have to be shipped from A to B, and they can't go into free circulation in any other country en route. There's also some minimum operations. So some of the rules against some commodity codes will say the preferential origin can only be given if this specific change has occurred. And also what we see is general tolerance. So how much foreign material can be used to create those products. Then finally, what we get is something called cumulation, which has lots of different forms. And so what we see is bilateral, regional, diagonal, and full. Bilateral is the most basic and is common to all trade deals, so I'll come on to that shortly. How this is kind of managed is via something called list rules that specifically cover minimum operations and general tolerance at commodity code level. So that's where there is no just standard set of rules. It is going to get quite specific depending on the exact product that you're trading with. So when we look at preferential origin, you'll see that this pattern is very similar. There's preferential origin rules. Again, they can be wholly obtained. So that is fairly identical to non-preferential origin. For processed products, this time there's the list rules and conditions, and sufficient processing has to have occurred. And the really important point here is that preferential origin rules will differ between trade agreements. If I'm processing something that requires it might say no more than 40% of non-originating materials can be used in the Korea deal. In the Canada deal, it might say up to 50% can. So that's where you really need to understand which commodities are being traded and which trade agreements you're accessing, and therefore figure out what rules in which agreements that you need to meet. So here's a couple of examples just to bring that into reality. So the first one you can see here at the top line is a rule. It's an example of a rule where a specific process has to be carried out for those goods to meet the preferential origin. And you can see this at HS 4-digit level, 4407. and it relates to wood sawn or chipped lengthwise, sliced or peeled. I won't read the whole thing, but you get the message there. And specifically for that to meet preferential origin, it has to be planed, sanded, or end jointed. So if none of those have happened, it keeps the origin where it came from, for example, Norway, and couldn't become British. If it comes here to the UK and is planed and sanded, then it can be UK origin. Equally, what we also see is this general tolerance example, so where a percentage of value is added and cannot be exceeded in the production process. So for here, you can see that the rule is actually set at the entire chapter level, so chapter 92, which relates to musical instruments and accessories. And what they're saying here is manufacture in which the value of all the materials used does not exceed 40% of the ex-works price of the product. So just to spend a bit more time on that wording, so when we're looking at rules of origin, the use of this word materials means non-originating materials. So if we're making something in the UK, 40% of the final sales price in value going in can have been imported from outside, and it would still constitute UK origin. If you exceeded that and you'd actually 60% of the value was made up from materials that you'd imported, it doesn't meet that preferential origin rule. So again, you can see that the rules differ. They sit at different lengths of the HS code, and they take very different forms depending on the product that is being traded. There is also minimum operations that are defined, which say these things specifically do not constitute a change of origin ever, whether together or a combination of all of those. So just to have a look at these, anything just to preserve the nature of the products or remove dust, sort them out, repackage, put them together in various sets, adding labels, assembling or disassembling, or a combination of one or more of those options would never constitute a change of origin. But unfortunately, what we see is that a lot of companies do think that just because they've changed the packaging and maybe labeled the bottles differently, then they can call it made in the UK, for example. So always the trade deals will confirm what the minimum operations are, the minimal operations, and really what they're saying is the processing must exceed this list. For the direct transport, just to expand on that a little more, they mean specifically without passing through another country, or if it goes through another country, it is either in customs control, so it can be transshipped through a port, or if it goes inland, it has to remain under customs supervision. So that would look like it being stored in a customs warehouse or temporary storage facility. And it may be that if that's occurred, the customs authority in that transshipment country may need to also provide some evidence that those goods have not been changed in any way. And if any of you are dealing with pipeline goods, the definition of direct transport is without interruption across another country there. So very specific. Just to also expand on cumulation here. So there's different forms of cumulation. I'm only really going to go into detail in bilateral cumulation because that's the one common to all origin arrangements, and I've been asked a number of questions in this area recently. So what cumulation says is that if there's a trade agreement between the UK and the EU, then you can use the UK origin materials, but you could also use EU origin materials to get to that percentage threshold. So, for example, if it allowed 60% of foreign materials to be input, but 40% had to come from the originating country, but actually only 10% came from the UK and a further 30% came from the EU, you could still call that originating and allow it to meet that trade deal because of accumulation. So the 40% in that case of originating materials would be met through bilateral accumulation. And all the other accumulation forms are just expanding that a little further. So for example, with GSP, they might have regional accumulation, so a group of GSP countries may be able to use each other's materials to constitute originating materials to help them meet those agreements. But that's the principle that you need to understand. So if your supply chain is currently reliant on a lot of EU materials, but you're looking to then process in the UK and ship back into the EU, and you're worried that you won't have enough UK origin, that's where accumulation will give you a solution. So when it comes to preferential origin, in order to prove that the goods meet preferential origin, traditionally it would be a preference certificate that was used, and they take the form of an EUR1 or an EUR Med if there's been some pan-Euro Med accumulation there, or a Form A for GSP. You might notice that ATR is missing from this list because it's not actually the same sort of agreement. ATR relates to an agreement between Turkey and the EU where they're actually in a customs union together. So the ATR is allowing those goods without any rules of origin to move in free circulation from Turkey into the EU without payment of tax, although there's still a customs entry requirement, and vice versa. So that sits outside of this kind of mold where we're focused on rules of origin. So the EUR1 and EUR Med specifically relate to EU trade deals. So we expect this certification to change from the 1st of January, and it will look something like a UK R1 instead. Equally, in some cases, preferential statements can be issued instead. So if the invoice is less than 6,000 euros, you don't need to provide a preference certificate. You can confirm the origin, the preferential origin status on the commercial invoice. All of these statements where you write a country of origin should always be on commercial paperwork and not transport documents, just for your info. So under 6,000 euros, or in the case of overseas countries and territories under 10,000, there's just a bit more of a threshold there for those sort of territories. Or you get an authorization, so that allows you to exceed those maximum thresholds if you're approved by the customs authorities to do so. And what that looks like in practice is either you hold approved exporter status or registered exporter status, or both. Now again, with all things in international trade, nothing's entirely simple. So approved exporter status relates to where you go to a customs authority and there'll be a specific statement that has to go on a commercial invoice or other commercial document. As you can see here from the extract in the middle, you quote your authorization number and you declare that the products are of, for example, EU preferential origin for now, UK preferential origin from next year. And that's a statement that you can put on all of your invoices. If some goods meet it and some goods don't, then usually it's something like an asterisk is used to differentiate the lines on the commercial invoice that this relates to and the lines that it does not. Registered exporter status is a very similar scheme, but in this case, you're given an authorization number and you can go onto an EU REX database and that number can be verified. So a lot of trade deals these days use one or the other of these schemes. So as a UK exporter, it is possible to become both an approved exporter and a registered exporter. Approved exporter status relates to the lion's share of trade agreements, but registered exporter status has been used with a few more recent ones, for example, the Canada-EU trade agreement. And we don't really have clarity from the UK government as to what they're going to be favouring from 2021 onwards. So it's possible UK companies will still be expected to apply for both to access the full range of trade agreements. Registered exporter status is also something that is used on the GSP scheme. So if you're importing from those developing countries, rather than needing your GSP certificate, you can ask your supplier to become a registered exporter. However, note that that currently is an EU website driven thing, so I wouldn't push them on it too much until we have more clarity next year. In terms of checking, I touched on this a little earlier. From an import perspective, HMRC does monitor, especially goods that are imported under preference. You are expected to hold the original preference certificate or the commercial documentation copies with the registered exporter reference number or approved exporter reference number for a minimum of 3 years. And quite often the goods will clear on arrival, and a couple of years later you'll receive a letter from a HMRC team requesting you to either post original certificates to them or provide the evidence that was stated at the time of import. If for any reason you cannot present that evidence upon that check within that 3-year period, then customs can ask for the duty to be paid, even though you claimed a relief on arrival. So the record keeping element is extremely important. Equally, if you're found to be raising preference documents for exports and they arrive at export origin, destination country even, for example, they get to Saudi and the authorities open up and it does say made in somewhere that isn't where you're saying it's from, you know, they're going to kind of kick off to the UK customs authorities, and that's where maybe a fine or a penalty would come back to the exporter. It's rare, but it happens. So it's just good to be aware that all of this is monitored. Okay, so further guidance and support is available. The first place to look really is in the various notices that HMRC publish. So as you can see here, there's some general guidance for imports. On notice 828, there's rules of origin for various countries, all bundled under the same sort of rules. But then you also see that there's specific guidance for rules of origin for Mexico or trade with Turkey that have different rules to other countries. So they're really good reference points, and you'll find that when you get into that guidance, there's a lot to it to cover. There's also these government guidance now. They seem to be moving away from customs notice numbers and onto guidance. So this is a specific wording that you would need to look up to land on the right guidance. So existing UK trade agreements with non-EU countries is a really crucial one that you're going to keep needing to check back to, not only up until the start of next year, but probably for forevermore, because trade agreements are constantly being negotiated. You know, most countries want to get as many trade agreements as they can because it promotes exports, and also on the import side has benefits for consumers by reducing the costs. So they're generally perceived as a good thing if it's fair at each end of that deal. Rules of origin for imported and exported goods, again, is more general guidance before you get into those specific notices. And then also there's some overview on the EC site on rules of origin that is quite useful, just showing what is common throughout those kind of preferential trade agreements. If you're still stuck and you can't decide what origin your goods should be, then you can apply for something called binding origin information. So as you can see here, you have to provide customs with a fair amount of detail in terms of the value and the tariff headings and what went into it. So usually you're doing a kind of bill of materials on a spreadsheet and saying where each component came from and what it cost. The code that you believe it is, and then you can see here whether that relates to import or export, or whether it's preferential or non-preferential. And HMRC will come back and confirm the origin that you can use for those goods. And this is a free service. So it's if you're struggling to get that certainty, you know, this gives you a solution. Okay, so I'm going to hand back over to Will to do the last quiz
Last
with
poll.
you.
Or quiz, yeah, we could be like
Sorry,
a Zoom call quiz. So the last poll is asking, which of these origin-related matters concerns you the most? The options there are trade deals or monitoring which ones are available, non-preferential origin, understanding labeling and COO, preferential origin, meeting preferential rules of origin, completion of binding origin information requests, or approved exporter status applications. And while people are answering that poll, we can go into the Q&A. So, Holly, one of the questions we've received, we've had a few, but here's one from Michelle, who's asked, how do you define origin on kits of parts with multiple origins, i.e. a kit of electrical items, and which has a mixture of EU, China, Japan parts?
Right, yeah, good question. So with kits, generally speaking, each item needs to be given its own origin that constitute the individual kind of commodities within that kit. There are a couple of exceptions to that where the kit can kind of form a very specific purpose and has its own tariff code and its own right to cover the whole kit. But if you're putting in like 5 completely different commodities and they hold their own commodity codes, then you would declare the origin against each item in that kit and you wouldn't group it all together under one.
Thank you, Holly. And just going to close the poll now and share the results. So 41% have said preferential origin, that's followed by 33% on trade deals, and then the others are smaller. Any thoughts on that poll there, Holly?
Yeah, again, I think I agree in terms of meeting maybe those preferential rules of origin is likely going to be the most challenging element. And for EU UK trade, if there is a trade agreement, that will likely be reduced due to accumulation. But in the case of different trade agreements, for example, if there was one between the UK and America, and the UK producer is reliant on a lot of EU materials, then they may struggle to meet the specific kind of UK origin rules to that deal. So I think this is going to be a massive area going forwards.
Thank you, Holly. And if we move to the next slide, I think there will just be a reminder there of how people can ask the questions. And the next one I'll ask is from Gotson. I hope I pronounced that right. And the question is, which free trade agreements allow origin to be declared by the sender in commercial invoice versus requiring certification, e.g. Japan allows it or Canada doesn't?
Right, yes. So with that one, Japan, I believe, is on approved exporter, whereas Canada is on registered exporter. So actually, they both allow it, but you would need 2 distinct approvals in order to make those declarations for those 2 different trade deals. And you need to get into the detail, the guidance that relates to each specific trade deal, which will determine which of those approvals that they will recognise or where certification is required. And let's not forget there's always that compromise as well that has to be had at some time where you're exporting to certain more complex countries, export market wise, where just because the trade deal says that a certificate isn't needed doesn't mean the customs officer won't demand one. So sometimes, even though the trade agreement allows for it, if the company you're trading with in a particular destination insists that they need a certificate, it may be that it hasn't fully been implemented in practice.
Thank you, Holly. A question in from Jutta, who's asked, what happens if the purchase price of your non-originating components is fluctuating and you cannot attribute a single batch of raw materials to a finished product sold at a specific price?
I'd probably need to look into that in a little more detail, but you might get away with an average per year or something like that, or you would ideally the range of fluctuation would still allow for enough originating percentage to mean that you always met the origin. If it's going above and below the threshold, you might be able to get average, but I think in that case I'd do a binding origin application with customs to make sure that was something that they would permit. Or if not, you're looking at it at a shipment by shipment basis, which would be quite a lot of admin to keep on top of.
Okie dokie. So a question in from Catherine. I think it's a clarifications on minimal operations. And Catherine's asking, what counts as simple assembly? For example, low or non-specialized skill assembly.
Simple assembly, I've always interpreted it as something like putting chair legs onto a chair. So not something more advanced like bringing in 1,000 different parts and creating a car. Again, we'd probably need to look at the specifics of the exact product and what was happening to try and get to the bottom of whether it was simple or not.
Thank you. And yeah, getting a few kind of sector-specific or company-specific questions. We'll try to keep these broadly relevant as much as possible, though I appreciate everyone has a range of questions. One from Helen, who's asked, if goods arrive from a country of origin, for example, China, then arrive into the UK and are cleared into free circulation, if these same goods are then re-exported, do the goods become UK origin?
No, that's exactly what we've really been discussing during the webinar. They would need to be substantially processed or changed. So if they've just been imported to be re-exported, they remain Chinese origin.
Thank you, Holly. A good example to clarify. And a question from McCullough, which is on everyone's minds, which is, I would be interested in how rules of origin work for Republic of Ireland to GB, Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland to GP, or EU, Republic of Ireland to GB. So I guess how is it going to work over the much discussed Irish protocol?
Yes, so in terms of UK mainland to Northern Ireland, there shouldn't be any associated rules of origin. Between Northern Ireland and the EU, that's what we're very much expecting details to come out of in the UK-EU trade agreement, if there is one, and in the event of no deal, again, the Irish protocol will need to expand on that quite significantly. So I know that the UK border model was released, but it didn't really cover the Northern Ireland part of the process, and we're hoping for more details to come be clarified by the government in, well, they did initially say by the end of July, but I think it will be a few weeks as yet.
Thank you, Holly. A question in from Garcia, again, I hope I've pronounced that right, who asked, is it correct to assume that in the case of there not being a deal with the EU, no diagonal accumulation will be allowed in UK trade deals with non-EU countries?
Yeah, that is the assumption that we're working to.
Thank you. Just trying to read through some of the other questions coming in now. Question from Peter, who asks, where can you find which countries are linked to approved exporter status or registered exporter status?
There will be some guidance within the various customs notices, but probably the easiest is to look on the applications of each of those. I believe they therefore list which countries each application is relevant to, so that's probably going to be the quickest way to get to the bottom of that.
Thank you. And another question just on approved exporter status. There are quite a lot of questions on it. Mr. Stokes has asked, if you have approved exporter status, can you use it for exporting to all countries or just a country which you originally applied for? I think by all means, all for which approved exporter applies.
Yes. In theory, you should only be raising it for those that you applied for, because each time you list a country, your authorization needs to reflect on how you meet the rules for that specific destination. So if you are using it to export to more countries than you were originally including in your application, it's a matter of just updating your authorization. So to demonstrate that your goods also meet the rules for the new countries. So I would recommend you contact the team on the original approval letter and just say, we are also now exporting to kind of XYZ. What further information do you need from us to include that in our approval?
Thank you, Holly. We'll do a couple more questions because we're running low on time now. One question from Zanita asks, she distributes diesel engine parts globally and sometimes gets asked for a long-term supply declaration by the customers. Could you clarify if a distributor should provide it or should it be filled by the manufacturer?
It would usually be provided by the manufacturer, but if the distributor is wanting to keep the manufacturer anonymous, then in that case we would generally recommend the distributor get one from the manufacturer, and then that would allow the distributor to raise their own confirming that origin.
And one last question. This one is from Alicia, who asks, where can we find the required details or list of rules for rules of origin based on the last substantial economically justified processing or working?
Okay, so if it's non-preferential origin, the list rules are currently on the EC website. If it's preferential origin, you're needing to go into the list rules for the specific trade agreements that you're working under. There may also be an expansion on the HMRC notices covering those trade deals that also list those rules. So either the trade deal or the relevant UK customs guidance.
Well, many thanks, Holly, for all of those answers, and thank you everyone for all the questions as well. There's plenty more as well, so sorry if we couldn't get to all of them, but we can. You can always contact us at info@ukcustomsacademy.co.uk, and I think on the last slide you'll see more details about how to contact the Academy. So at this point, thank you so much, Holly, for the time today, the presentation and the answers. Here, as mentioned, you will find all the further information you will need for any further questions or queries. And please do let us know as well if you have any further suggestions for topics for future webinars. I will leave this slide open for a few more seconds before closing the webinar, but from me and Holly, goodbye everyone and stay safe.